I'm not really sure how I'm going to do this without you starting the session, so I think I'm going to be doing the introduction as well. I think I've been chosen to do this probably because I'm one of those kind of people that can see at least three sides of every argument. So what I'm not intending to do is to take sides in this, but we're kind of expecting, from what we know about the subject of fossil legal, that there are many points of view and there are controversies. So what I thought I would try to do is to go back to the beginning, to the origin of where what we're going to talk about started. And I've been thinking about this for hundreds of years. And I've always said what we're talking about is dodgy fossils, and I'm aware that most of you in this room don't have English as your mother tongue, so I'm putting this up as an example of the kind of thing that I'm perhaps talking about, which is how do we think about the meaning of words? So what does dodgy mean to you? And if you were American, you might have a different idea of what I have, and as European people, you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. You're saying dodgy fossils. I mean, there's something peculiar, not quite right about these fossils. They're perhaps illegal, or you shouldn't have them, or where do they come from? All those kinds of issues. And they're the topics that the other speakers in this symposium are going to be talking about. So it's about the meaning of words. A lot of what I'm going to say is about that, and particularly about what you think if you don't speak English, because the founding legislation upon which all the other stuff I think that we talk about in terms of are these fossils dodgy or not comes from an original English piece of legislation written in English. And I think this is the cause of a lot of our problems. It's the 1970 UNESCO Convention. I mean, sure enough, it's about preventing the illegal export and import, but it's a transfer of ownership of cultural property. And really what I'm going to be talking about is, so what the hell has culture got to do with fossils? Is it any good for anybody? Is it even any good for paleontology? And for the round table, what I'd like you all to think about is what would you do if you ruled the world? I have no blooming idea at all what I would do. Well, perhaps if you asked me tomorrow, I'd have a different idea to what I think today. And I've got form, and this is quite embarrassing, maybe, because I was involved in this project of these, what turned out to be therizinosaur eggs with embryos from China, and I was curator of Leicester Museum at the time. Terry Manning was a collector preparator, and he acquired a lot of Chinese dinosaur eggs, acquired. And he said, it's fine, I've got the paperwork. So my museum got involved, and we helped to organise some of the preparation of these specimens, and of course they turned out to be important scientifically. I still don't know whether I should have done that. I think I was right because of what happened in the end. But as I've said, this whole business, there are many sides to the argument, and we've had probably similar conversations to the ones we're going to have today 2 or 3 times to my knowledge in the symposia in the past. The English Geological Curators Group, British Geological Curators Group had a seminar, and a lot of people fell out on that occasion. SVP, that didn't make a few people very pleased. And John Long's book, and I've just put this up because, can you read this? How to check if that fossil is legal. It's just a good example of the ambiguity of a lot of what we think about. And he says legal in the moral sense. Well, I really don't know what that means. Perhaps we can explore that idea. So, well, I couldn't think of it. Maybe I do have a bias. I couldn't think of very many good things that have come out of that 1970 convention. I could think of quite a lot of things that I think are bad for people and for paleontology. You know, we know of people that didn't get a job because of their opinion about the legality of fossils in museum collections, and people have fallen out quite badly. We know there's been several important paleontological specimens that have been impounded and therefore not available for science to be done on them. There's the issue of whether specimens in private collections should be published, and some eminent journals will refuse to take papers on specimens which aren't in public collections. There are people in this room, I think, probably been kicked out of various countries in the world for collecting. A big problem with that kind of legislation is that it creates a black market and everything that goes with that. Another side issue is that once you've got that kind of market in fossils, then the prices go up, and that means that scientific institutions which have small budgets can't afford to acquire the specimens. And what all that lot means is that there are specimens which are lost to the public domain and therefore to science. Another side of it is that because of the way the market operates, as a result of the legislation, indigenous people get exploited. They certainly don't get any advantage out of what happens. And at the same time, you might think that there are some examples of corruption, state employees, for example. So it's difficult. And why is it so difficult? Well, the first thing is this thing about cultural relativism. And I'm very aware of the fact that I'm going to very likely, just because of my background, my ignorance, I could very well offend people in the room. I could certainly offend people in developing world countries if I'm not very careful. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we're talking about the trading and the legality of fossils. What I'm going to talk about a lot is the meaning of words, the semantics of these words, culture and property, and it's quite difficult, but it's what colours all of our individual points of view about this issue. It's how we perceive the meaning of those words and then apply that to fossils. And so we're then talking about ethics, nothing to do with paleontology, but it's very important, which means we're talking about politics, really. Paleontology, I'm not going to mention it at all. What I am going to do is kind of take us back into the 20th century, because what I'm going to say is like a little microcosm of the story of the 20th century. I guess this guy is the founding father of the legislation that we're talking about, Nicholas Röhrig. He was, apart from those things, I suspect he was something of an eccentric, but probably a good guy. He was an amateur archaeologist. He was a painter in that kind of early Russian 20th century tradition. That's a self-portrait, and I think that says quite a lot. You know, he would dress up. He loved the Hindu Kush, and he collected artifacts. And because of the time when he lived and the country where he was brought up, he was just at the age in the early 20th century when the Russian-Japanese war was going on to be concerned about what was happening to the artifacts in those two countries, in the area where the fighting was going on, because just like in all wars, you know, there was looting going on, cultural artifacts were smashed, there was an illegal trade set up, all that kind of thing. And it was a result of his experience then, and I guess because he lived through the Russian Revolution, and therefore moved to the West, that he began to think about the importance of protecting cultural heritage in times of war, was what he was particularly thinking about. And he worked with colleagues in France and the United States, and eventually came up with this pact, the Vertebrate Pact, for the protection of artistic, scientific institutions, historic monuments, missions and collections in 1935. And he was a pacifist as well, and just as a complete side thing, that was the symbol they came up for, and that's the origin for the campaign for nuclear disarmament symbol. If you kind of reverse that, so that is the upside down Y, that is the CND symbol. So this is what the Vertebrate Pact says. What's important for our argument is that he said that these things should be considered as neutral, and he was talking about war, but he did say in time of peace as well as in war. And that pact was approved by the Committee for Museum Affairs of the League of Nations, which was the kind of predecessor, the precursor for the UN. It was set up as a result of the First World War. It's supposed to be international, and its primary aim was to promote peace between nations by talking rather than arguing. But it wasn't all that international. It had only 39 members when it started in 1920, which excluded Germany, Russia and America, so that kind of didn't have the main players, did it? But it got better. And largely as a result of the Vertebrate Pact, they set up a Commission for Museum Affairs. And then history repeated itself. Maybe the League of Nations wasn't entirely effective, because we then had the Second World War, and they had another go by starting the UN. And the similar child of the UN, of the Committee of Museum Affairs, was UNESCO. And so, built on the Vertebrate Pact, there was the Hague Convention, which more or less said the same thing, but just updated for the situation in the beginning of the Cold War, after the Second World War. And this is where we get on to the term cultural property. And they defined it as shall cover irrespective of origin or ownership. And it's the cultural heritage of every people. And yeah, it is still in force, but not working terribly well. So as a development of that, within UNESCO, within the UN, we then started talking about the legality, the situation for fossils, not in time of war. And that's where the 1970 convention comes from. But you see, what's happened is that between the Hague Convention and UNESCO 1970, we've gone from protection of cultural property to the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illegal Import and Export and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. So things are changing. The mindset is changing. And I suspect what's also changing is the kind of the view of the world that evolved in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And just, not that I'm going to talk about it, but just to remind us that UNESCO 1970 has also now evolved further, in that there's the Unidroit Convention, Unidroit Convention. So that's what the Hague Convention said, irrespective of origin or ownership, every people. But by the time we got to UNESCO 1970, it said for the purpose of this convention, the term cultural property, in brackets, now means property which on religious or secular grounds is specifically designated by each state. And that's the moment where things went wrong, as far as I can see, as being of importance for archaeology, prehistory, and all the rest of it. And there's also some ambiguity from that very beginning as to where fossils fit into that definition. Nicholas must be rolling in his grave by that time, I would have thought, what he was on about was it's the world, it's our shared human cultural property that he was trying to protect, and not individual nations, some other kind of property. So they define what categories of information fit. And here's the ambiguity. It says rare collections and specimens of fauna, flora, minerals and anatomy, comma, and objects of paleontological interest. I don't know what that comma is doing there. There's a difference between an Oxford comma, which is just part of a list, and in British English, whether putting a comma in there means that you change the subject. So I don't know whether it means that they have to be collections of objects of paleontological interest, or just comma and objects of paleontological interest. Who knows? Interpretation. It's yours, right? Well, UNESCO 1970 has been extremely influential, and I think the individual countries' legislation that we'll be talking about for the rest of the day largely comes out of that. I mean, there is some legislation, national legislation, that precedes it by date, but most of it is developed from what UNESCO says. So at the time of speaking, there's 131 signatories to that convention, national signatories. About 165 countries have bits of legislation. That seems to be, the math seems to be wrong there, but never mind. And of those, something like 59 countries have legislation that is specifically about fossils. But remember, we're talking primarily about the restriction of import and export of fossils here. So on top of that, we've got to count legislation about things like collecting from national monuments, those kinds of things. Protection of sites. I just said all that, didn't I? But there's a huge stack of legislation. Jeff and I have tried to kind of do a summary of it, and it drives you mad because there's so much of it and we can't read half of it anyway. Interestingly, we started to try and ask people in different countries how they interpreted their legislation. How do you summarise that? Well, SVB tried. So, I think I probably already said it. You know, I said that I can always see three sides of every argument, but actually the problem is that there are two ways of seeing the world, and therefore there are two ways, at least, in your own head, interpreting the legislation and then applying it. In Britain, we would say you have Cavaliers and Roundheads, and English people will know what I'm talking about. It's the people who, the two sides, I suspect, it's the people that feel they're entitled, that they're privileged to decide what everybody else does, and then there are the rest of us, I think probably me, who think the opposite, that try to see every side of the argument. Word. Right, meaning of words, very quickly. Culture is one of the most complicated words that anyone can think of. And if you try and run it through your head, just think about how many 5 or 6 meanings that straight away come to you that you can associate with that word culture. Here are the two distinct and incompatible ways of thinking. That's the reason for it. And it's the same that I can think of in pretty much all European languages. There's German, you know, all those different ways of interpreting the word culture. Culture in French, the same. I think, or even in Chinese. That's me looking it up in an English-Chinese dictionary, so pardon me if I'm misapplying cultural relativism. But it looks to me as though there's wenhua, which we'll come to that in a second, but there's also the biological sense of culture, like the stuff in a petri dish. Very different meaning. Related. that word, wenhua, it seems to be a bit like our word, well, the family of words in English which are process words that end in ization. So, civilization, it's this process of making people more like us in the West, maybe. And the word in China seems to have these same kind of feelings for one of our interpretations of the word culture. It's this bit about, is your language well chosen? Are you polite? That kind of culture. So maybe that's the meaning in Chinese. Now, so what the devil happens if we translate UNESCO 1970 into Chinese, they develop their own legislation, and then we try and translate that back into English, French, German, in order that we can understand what their legislation is saying. And it gets quite complicated, doesn't it? No wonder it's a problem. And from outside our world of paleontology, here's a lawyer who's got interested in what's happened with UNESCO 1970 as well, and he comes up with exactly the same arguments. One way is that, which is that it's human culture, our shared heritage, and the other way is that it's all mine, and it's worth quite a bit of money. That's the one where the export and import controls come from, of course. And I do need to go ever so quick now. Let me just very quickly work through the meaning of the word culture. Its origin is Latin, and in that sense it means this stuff, growing crops, looking after animals. And from that meaning have come these three others that have nothing to do with what we're talking about today. There's the coulter, which is the thing that cuts the soil before the plough comes along. Do you have a similar word in Dutch? I bet you do in German as well. Actually, in English, that started off as a Lowland Scots word from the French. But it's, that's the cultivation, farming use of the word culture. And then there's the go in a petri dish kind of culture. And then in French, as a side derivation, the word is culture. But if you think about the way the meaning that we're talking about evolved, straight away it split into two things. And this was kind of happening at the time of the Enlightenment, 18th century. So it went the two ways. It was the politeness thing, the culture. You were bringing up your children to speak nicely and to do watercolour painting, that kind of culture. And then there was the civilization, the process use of the word, which is, it's missionaries going to those foreign countries and teaching them how to be cultured and civilizing them. And so that's where the two meanings diverged, I think. And there's meanings in people's heads, aren't there? The evolution from the civilization one is that meaning of culture, cultures of the world. And so that's about the shared characteristics of people, and it's all of that stuff. Is that what the legislation is talking about? Or is it this one, which has come from teaching your kids to be polite? That kind of culture. So it's the arts. And so we're talking about, these are not things, but these are things. And so we're talking here about commodities rather than our shared human culture. And I ought to just mention property as well, since we're talking about cultural property. When Jeff and I were first talking about me coming to speak to you today, I said, perhaps I'll do the sceptical Marxist view. And it's nonsense, actually, because I've actually no idea of I couldn't define Marxism to you in two words. And I very much doubt that Carl had anything to say about fossils. That in fact it's irrelevant because it wasn't him that said, "Oh, property is theft." It was this gentleman here before Karl Marx ever even came up with it. But if we're talking about property, then we start to talk about not price, not value, but price. And quite a few individual countries' legislation, which has come out of UNESCO 1970, says, and how we're going to define our cultural property isn't only the way that I'm not very happy about, it's ours, but it's also, and it only really matters that it costs more than, this is euros, Eurofossils, 50,000 euros. Okay, you're safe below that, but that's not the point. What the point is to me is that it's saying that this is ours and it's worth a lot of money, and that's why we want it, and that's why we want to prevent its export and import, because it's part of, the books balancing of each country. It's nothing to do with cultural meanings. And I very much doubt it's anything to do with fossils. I mentioned this, didn't I? That I think that all this was happening at the time that the world itself was changing. At a time when capitalism was taking on a different form, when the world was becoming more globalised. And I think the way that the legislation was drafted in the first place and the way it's evolved subsequently, it's all in parallel with what happened in the second half of the 20th century. But, as I'm kind of winding up, questions for you to think about as the other speakers talk to us today and when we get to the round table at the end of it. Now that I've had this conversation with you about the meanings of words in your heads, what about the meanings of those words, culture and property, in the heads of the people who drafted the legislation? It was started by a big committee, the convention, and they must have all had thoughts about that, and what on earth did they think they meant by cultural property? And then they didn't actually do the drafting, they got lawyers to do that. What did they think the convention meant, and what did they themselves think? And then, because that legislation has been translated into 131 different languages, but fewer than that, what did they think the words meant? And then, what do the people that apply those pieces of legislation think they mean? And how are they misappropriated to suit the culture of that particular country, different meaning of the word culture? And finally, do fossils really apply anyway? I find it very difficult to see how, from the definitions we've now come up with for what cultural property means, it's difficult to see what fossils have got to do with human cultural heritage. They may, you might find a fossil in Scotland and say it's a Scottish fossil, but that's irrelevant. Fossils know no geopolitical boundaries. Except, okay, you could possibly argue that hominins, fossils, and, like Darwin's collection of fossils, they could just about, to me, be part of human cultural heritage, but the rest, no. So I'll leave you with this question, 4 questions. Of these nice people here, who's got the best cultural property claim? Who's got the best financial property claim? Ethical? Do I need to read the bottom one out? Well, it seems to me that the guy on the left there, he has quite a big claim to fossils found in Araripe, to his and Brazilian cultural property, but does he get a look in to the mafia? They have quite a bit of control over what happens, but that's not very ethical, is it? Who has the best financial property claim? And I would say that Mr. Thing on the left there probably has quite a good financial claim because he's put in the work to collect the fossil. And he might have the best ethical claim as well. Well, I should talk about the dealers and comparators. Just think about their legitimacy of their claim. Us curators, including Dr. Dave there. We're now moving to the people that you and I would think they don't have any given claim at all. You know, Mr. Moneybags, Mr. Tony Blair. But the truth is, when we come to question 4, who decides what happens? It's those guys there. Maybe I did have a point of view. Oh, forgot about that one. This is Mark Morell, and I think he was talking about a dealer. Well, I do say all of that, but I don't love. I do love fossils. So Mark Morell and I must disagree somewhere. I'm not quite sure where it is. So what would you do if you were a saying? Thank you.